which was incorporated as an NGO in October 2018. The objective of the think tank is policy-oriented research and research-based policy advice. Since the 2.5 years that it has been in existence, it has been contributing significantly to policy making, and you're welcome to visit our website and see the type of programs and articles that we are contributing. It is in this very context that we started this webinar series, generally every Friday post-lunch, in which we invite the best minds in our country as well as the best minds across the world. Professors from Harvard University, Stanford University, London School of Economics have already spoken to us. A month back, we had Nobel laureate Professor Michael Kramer, who spoke to us. And exactly a month from now, on November 19, we have another Nobel laureate, Professor Paul Milgram, who will be speaking to us on auction system. This was just an illustration that we try to bring the best minds in the country and the world to speak to our audience and participants. In this very context, the Afghanistan issue became very important, and this is the second talk that we are organizing on Afghanistan. Today, we have invited Ambassador Mukhopadhaya to speak to us. To chair the session is Dr. Narendra Jadhav. Dr. Narendra Jadhav is the Member of Parliament Rajya Sabha, nominated by the President of India. He is an independent member of the Parliament and is working on various committees of Finance, Commerce, Information Technology, Social Justice, and Empowerment and Welfare of SC/ST, as well as consultative committees, External Affairs, Tourism, and Culture. He is basically an educationist with a PhD in economics from Indiana University. He was the executive director at the RBI. He was also advisor at the International Monetary Fund. He's been to Afghanistan, and therefore we thought it will be most appropriate that he chairs the session today. He's a distinguished professor at various universities. The most important thing that I look at him, he is a prolific writer in 3 languages, Marathi, English, and Hindi. He has written or edited 41 books. He's a recipient of nearly 70 national and international awards. So we are so happy that he could spare time and speak to us today and be with us to chair this session. Our speaker today for the day is Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhaya. And Ambassador Mukhopadhaya has been into the Foreign Service, and after the Foreign Service, he joined the Center for Policy Research as a senior visiting fellow in June 2019. He worked long years in the Indian Foreign Service and served in various capacities in Indian embassies and missions in Mexico, Cuba, France, and the United Nations, and Afghanistan. He was India's ambassador to Syria, Afghanistan, and Myanmar in Afghanistan from 2010 to 2013. He also reopened the Indian embassy in Kabul in November 2001 as Charge d'Affaires after the ouster of Taliban in Afghanistan in November 2001. So we thought, if we want to, when the dust settles, we want to know exactly what is the story in Afghanistan. We requested him to come and speak to us. Today, he's speaking to us on the strategic fallout of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. With this, I hand over the session to the chairman, Dr. Jadhav, and invite the guest speaker to please present his thoughts.
Well, friends, I'm delighted to be here in this forum, and I wish to commend the EGROW Foundation for great work that they are doing, and also arranging this webinar on a subject of a great contemporary relevance. And we have a speaker today who is very well experienced in the foreign policy and the strategy, and he has had the first-hand experience of working in Afghanistan. So we couldn't have chosen a better person to speak to us about the strategic fallout after the recent developments in Afghanistan. So without much ado, may I now request Ambassador Gautam Mukhopadhaya to make his presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Narendra Jadhav, for the honor of chairing this session, and to Mr. Charan Singh for inviting me to this very distinguished forum. To this very distinguished forum, and amidst invitees of such exalted character as the Nobel laureates that you mentioned. I'm no match for them, but let me also say that I'm privileged to follow my predecessor, first post-Taliban ambassador in Afghanistan, Ambassador Vivek Karju, who has already addressed you. So let me just begin right away, because I have a bit of a harsh deadline at about 5 o'clock. By saying that, actually one could approach Afghanistan in terms of many, many questions that are current in people's mind. I mean, foremost among them are the question of why, the Afghan government collapsed so easily after 20 years of US support. What was really the US mission and their intentions and their objectives in withdrawal? Is it something that they had, came to by accident, or was it by design, or was it anticipated? The kind of messy withdrawal that took place. What was the Pakistani design, and has it gone according to plan? Should now India accept reality as it is today, and either legitimize or perhaps work with the Taliban in some ways? And then, of course, the harsh realities of the humanitarian crisis that is facing Afghanistan in the very near future. But I actually chose, since a lot of these questions have been well handled in the past, I actually chose to really title the subject of my talk today as the strategic fallout because of Afghanistan, and of the US withdrawal, because I think that gives a wide umbrella within which your membership and all those present here might like to pose their questions to me. So let me begin, really in terms of just like some very basic facts. And pardon me if I sometimes overstate my case for the sake of clarity. Of course, there's always room for nuance. But let me say that one of the first sort of realities that we face is a complete upturning or overturning of the regional equations and balance of power in the region to the west and to the north of us with the US withdrawal in Afghanistan. Until just August 15, the balance of power or the equations were more or less like this. You had an Islamic Republic, a democratic republic in Afghanistan, supported by the US with a large number of troops up to a certain point, by the entire NATO and democratic Europe and the West as a whole, democratic Asia and India, all pretty much aligned in one way. And even the Soviet, even the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians, not ill-disposed towards the Islamic Republic that was in force there. Overnight, practically, we have a complete inversion in terms of the, power equations. What we have today is a theocratic, a rather violent theocratic state that has taken over Afghanistan by military force, supported entirely over 20 to 30 years by Pakistan, now reinforced by the strategic heft and economic muscle of China. And both Russia and Iran also aligned against the United States and more towards, towards the Taliban at this point of time. In some cases, there are also very close ties with China. So, the consequences of this are, of course, likely to be quite seismic, because in effect, what they do is that these are going to have geopolitical ramifications, quite comparable, if not absolutely similar, to what happened when the Soviet forces withdrew Afghanistan in 1989. And we'll come back to this towards the end of our talk. So I'm going to look at 4 or 5 principal relationships right now. I'm going to conspicuously leave out India, just in case, because we can address that in the question and answer. First, the role of Pakistan, then the role of the United States, what China expects to get out of this, and then finally, what is the scenario that we see in Afghanistan in the near future or the medium-term future, and then finally the long-term strategic fallout. So addressing Pakistan first. For Pakistan, this is virtually a fulfillment of a 20-year strategy, a hybrid war that they have conducted at different stages, depending on the opportunities that have presented itself to them, to virtually take over Afghanistan without actually fighting a war, an occupation or an invasion, if you like, with an Afghan face in the form of the Taliban, but really Pakistani brains and minds behind it, and also Pakistani hands actually involved in the operation. I will elaborate this a little further. The Taliban project actually goes back to the mid-90s, in fact, maybe even early 90s, sometime around 92, 94, when it was incubated by the then Home Minister in Pakistan, Nasrullah Babar, who was an ex-general. And it was basically, basically a kind of religious militia that was created out of orphans who were in the refugee camps in the Pakistan side of the Durand line. I conspicuously don't call it a border here. Pakistan side of the Durand line, because a lot of Afghans don't accept that. And in the refugee camps that grew up there in the course of the Soviet intervention and the kind of refugee crisis that created. Initially, I would say that the Taliban were not a terrorist force. They were an ultra-conservative religious militia brought up in, so to say, neo-Deobandi, seminaries or madrasas in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, led by people like Samiul Haq and the Haqqani madrasas. What the initial objectives of the Pakistani establishment, this was in the time of Benazir Bhutto, was to launch a caravan in order to connect Pakistan much better with Central Asia. But it was not a terrorist force. It ruled by it was a repressive rule. It imposed a very ultra-conservative social code in Afghanistan, but it didn't come into power through terrorism per se. And it was an establishment. I also reopened the embassy of India in Kabul in 2001. It was an establishment that invested virtually nothing in development. In effect, what Pakistan was trying to do in Afghanistan at that stage, when only 3 countries in the world had recognized the Taliban, was to literally throw Afghanistan into the Stone Age, both ideologically as well as economically. During the 5-6 years of Taliban rule in Afghanistan, there was virtually no reconstruction, let alone development. So this is one point that I want to make. The Taliban actually radicalized in its second phase, what I call Taliban 2.0, which was when it was ousted from Afghanistan, and took shelter and refuge and sanctuary in Pakistan. This was the time, over a period of time, depending on the opportunities that presented itself, Pakistan, together with the Taliban leadership, worked to radicalize themselves, started utilizing terrorism, initially IEDs, improvised explosive devices. Eventually, they started recruiting these, students from the madrasas, the Talibs, into suicide squads and for suicide missions, and then also worked up the chain towards complex attacks. That means commando attacks combined with suicide attacks, then vehicle-borne suicide attacks, and so on. So there was a progressive escalation in the level, nature, techniques, and quality of violence that took place over the 20 years. And opportunities presented themselves. I think one very dramatic opportunity was when in 2003-04, the United States, turned its attention towards Iraq, thinking that the work in Afghanistan had virtually been done. And this was an opportunity that the Pakistani ISI saw in order to step up its kind of involvement in terrorism in Afghanistan. And that's when the Taliban really began to revitalize itself and regroup itself and start becoming more active. After that, there was a period between 2009 and 10 when the international community started talking about peace and reconciliation. This was marked by the London conference. But even before that, immediately after that, President Obama came out with his strategy of surge and withdrawal. After the intervention in Iraq, in some ways, the US troops actually started off with a counter-terrorism campaign in Afghanistan, basically oriented towards the Al-Qaeda. They enlarged it after learning from their experiences in Iraq to include a counter-insurgency strategy that dealt with the Taliban. And then starting from about 2010, when they announced their surge and their withdrawal subsequently, by 2013 to 14, they had turned into a training and equipping mission. In other words, they had already signaled to Pakistan and the Taliban that they were leaving. So these were sort of very important signals that Pakistan and the Taliban picked up to, kind of escalate their involvement in Afghanistan. One of the ways that they did it was to train a lot of Maulvis from Afghanistan in Pakistan in those same very neo-Deobandi establishments. By this time, there were elements of Wahhabism also very deeply entrenched in it, and send these Maulvis back to Afghanistan. Together with that, they began to start embedding themselves in the ungoverned areas, in the rural areas of Afghanistan. Gradually, they started forming shadow governments. They picked up a lot of intelligence. So this was the initial stage of preparation for that thing. But simultaneous with this, they did 2 or 3 other things. They launched a massive information warfare campaign in Afghanistan, particularly in the rural areas. They pretty much mastered social media and the use of ICT in being able to conduct their both information operations as well as psychological warfare. And then you saw psychological warfare also being used very dramatically in the course, particularly in the last few years. And their primary instrument of the psychological warfare, which was intended to literally wear down the resistance of the Afghan people, was terrorism. Daily acts of terrorism against very typically actually, soft targets, and increasing radicalization of a number of groups that were involved in Afghanistan. I'll also mention the groups because we talk about Taliban. Sometimes when we look beyond the Taliban, we talk about Pakistan's role. But what we often forget is that there are close to 20 or 30 other radical extremist and insurgent groups operating in the Afghanistan-Pakistan space, encouraged by Pakistan, that stretch from Chechnya and Dagestan through Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, including Iran, and of course a very large number of these outfits that are based in Pakistan itself. Some of them are just fundamentalist and want the same kind of objectives of Shariat rule as the TTP, the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan. But there are other anti-Shia groups like the Lashkar-e-Jhangvi and Sipahi Sahiba. There are anti-Indian groups like the Lashkar-e-Taiba and the Jaish-e-Muhammad. And there are, several other similar outfits that have come up and down over the years. They include also, for example, the IMU, the Hizb ut-Tahrir, there's another Tajik group which goes by the name of a kind of Jamaat-e Ansarullah. There is the ETIM, the East Turkestan Islamic movement that is targeted against China. And then finally at the last stages, we saw a very sophisticated military operation, clearly masterminded by Pakistan, in first occupying the northern part of Afghanistan, then the west, closing off possible routes of intervention that had taken place during during 2001. Even before that, actually embedding the Pashtun and, to a certain extent, infiltrating even amongst the Tajik and Uzbek communities, where, by the way, the Islamic State had also made an entry. And then, firstly, securing the peripheries and then moving in for the kill in the Pashtun areas and finally Kabul. And when they could not any longer sustain it by just sheer psychological warfare, information operations, one of the things that they did was they conducted a very skillful psychological operation to try and convince the Afghan government that they were willing to settle for a kind of inclusive government, that there would be a peaceful transition, not a military transition. In fact, some of the Afghan government officials and authorities at that time issued instructions to many of their own appointed governors, as well as to the ANDSF, not to fight, but in fact to surrender. So, that to a great extent explains, the kind of absolute and sudden capitulation on the part of the government and security forces in the last days. But I would also say that the shock of the withdrawal by the United States added and contributed to it, because apart from the psychological effect of that was the fact that a lot of the technical support that was provided to the ANDSF, whether it was air support or maintenance support for its sophisticated weaponry, which all, by the way, had to be NATO standard, not South Asia standard, all that was withdrawn very suddenly. Next, the US role. It is tempting to think that the US left because it was tired, or that Afghanistan had become a big headache and they were just dying to get rid of it. But in fact, actually, there is much more at work than this. One can understand the fatigue with the kind of endless war that Biden talked about, and perhaps even Trump believed in, that this was not really a war that the United States needed to conduct. But the cost of the war in blood and pressure was no longer very great for the US in terms of casualties, even in terms of expenditure. So the US could easily have stretched this on. It was not even a political issue, major political issue in the election campaign, and it's not even a major political issue now. The real reason was, in fact, that I think they began to feel that by once they had eliminated Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, or they thought they had eliminated, because UN reports clearly maintain that Al-Qaeda continues to be present and active in Afghanistan. What they thought was that, in effect, over these 20 years, they had provided net security for their chief strategic rivals in the region and the world. China on the one hand, Russia on the other, and Iran on the third. And so one argument, I think a benign argument, is that they decided, all right, so long we have been providing net security to them, I think if we actually let them handle their own security. But I would go a little further. I think the United States actually facilitated and enabled and stacked both the battlefield and the diplomatic table in favor of the Taliban. And not just the Taliban. In fact, the United States went a long way, at least civil society or a lot of the think tanks that were advising the US government at that stage, went a long way to whitewash and rehabilitate the Taliban, talking about the new Taliban. And it didn't stop at the Taliban. It also included the Haqqani network. Sirajuddin Haqqani was given a very prominent op-ed space by the New York Times. And at a certain point of time, this was around the time of the Doha deal, February 2020, they even began to project Anas Haqqani, a second generation Haqqani leader, as a possible, government face of the future. So I cannot escape the suspicion, and this is of course a debatable point, that the United States actually facilitated the return of the Taliban, along with all the associate groups that are with them, in order to actually destabilize Afghanistan and Central Asia, primarily with China, Russia, and Iran in their mind. And the Afghans, the Central Asian republics, and India were just collateral damage in the course of it, which they or we have to manage by ourselves. Why do I say this? Because at one level, it is baffling that the United States should cede strategic space in the weakest underbelly of China, in Xinjiang, when it has made China the principal subject of its strategic containment globally and worldwide, and in particular in the Indo-Pacific. And so it is tempting to conclude that while they started off their involvement in Afghanistan as a counter-terrorism mission, then expanded it to become a counter-insurgency mission, because after all, the terrorism was embedded in a kind of polity and ecosystem, then changed to a training and equipping mission, that perhaps now the Americans have conceived of their continued involvement in this region in Central Asia more in terms of an intelligence operation or an intelligence mission. And that's why you see a much greater salience and presence of the CIA director, than any longer the Pentagon or the Central Command. In fact, as far as the military focus is concerned, it has very clearly shifted to the Indo-Pacific, to the Quad, and to the AUKUS, which is the latest arrangement that has come out of that. Now, did the US, you may wonder, why would the US do something that is so destabilizing and that embarrassed it so much in the context of its actual withdrawal? I think there were simply very plain, very bad tactical errors made by the US, errors of judgment as well as errors of operations. But I think one of the points that I would like to just highlight here is that I think they put too much trust. I mean, Taliban has always used deception as part of its armory of tactics and techniques in the course of its history of its negotiations, starting from the 1994, 95, 96, when the US first reached out to them. They have made vague promises. None of them have ever been fulfilled. And I think the United States was led to believe that because they had given a very definite deadline of withdrawal as August 31, the Taliban would not embarrass them and take over Kabul first. And in fact, Kabul was not just taken over by the Taliban, they were taken over by the Haqqani network, which the US leadership very often, particularly its military leadership, has been very clear, has been an extended, as they called it once, a veritable extension of the ISI. So clearly there were miscalculations involved. But broadly, I would say in terms of strategic terms, that this is something that they were prepared for, if they did not actually encourage. In other words, it was anticipated. So I'll now turn to China. I said that in many ways, the US has embarked upon this strategy of bringing back the Taliban in order to destabilize China foremost, but I guess also Russia through the Central Asian republics. But at the same time for China, China is probably aware of this. At the same time for China, the temptation of a vacated space in Afghanistan, given China's global ambitions, given China's perception of US decline, is almost too tempting to pass up. In many ways, what it does is it fulfills 2 or 3 of China's sort of grander designs. For one, China has a 400 billion, 25-year geo-economic deal with Iran. And a kind of safe passage through Afghanistan, or let's say a kind of passage through Afghanistan, allows it to connect its western extremity, where they are trying very hard to control, the Uyghur population in Xinjiang, to actually penetrate the Central Asian mountains from the Pamir down to the Ladakh range, and to actually tie up through its CPEC, through Pakistan, as well as across the Pamirs and the Karakoram range and the Hindu Kush into the Persian Gulf. And by doing so, at a time when in many ways the US is actually kind of pulling out of the Middle East as its principal focus, it will then become a player in the Middle East, in the Persian Gulf, and it will also to a great extent secure its energy supplies. This is the pull factor for China. The push factor is that this is a very convenient alternative and escape through Chinese territory, through Central Asia, from the pressures that China faces from the US and the Quad, and also, I would say, generally the West, including many of the European countries who are concerned about China, in the Indo-Pacific. So it fulfills 2 or 3 roles on the part of for China. But in addition, I think Pakistan and China have a kind of mutually beneficial or mutually beneficial relationship here. Pakistan and China would be riding piggyback on each other in Afghanistan. Pakistan would in effect be the eyes and ears for China in a territory that it does not know very well. And China would provide the economic muscle and the strategic heft, if possible, to keep Afghanistan under Pakistani and China domination, but also to stabilize it and pursue what it now talks about is its geoeconomic strategy. On the face of it, it is absurd that Pakistan should be talking about geoeconomics when its own economy is in such poor condition. But clearly, what it is attempting to do is to ride on China into the region. And their fundamental objective, which converges with that of China, is that Pakistan's ambition for a long time has been to sever Afghanistan's historical and traditional economic as well as political and cultural relationship with India and reorient Afghanistan towards Central Asia. And China, of course, has pretty much the same objective. China has no particular interest in the Indian market for Afghan goods. They would like to be able to utilize Afghanistan's fabled 3 trillion worth of minerals, as well as hydrocarbons and other resources towards its own ends, and add to its BRI, add to its investments, add to its strategic thrust towards West Asia. How do we see now? But problem with China's ambitions here is that Afghanistan remains extremely unstable, extremely violent. In 2001, when I reopened the Indian embassy, when the Taliban capitulated to the Northern Alliance, it was during the period of Ramzan. The atmosphere was subdued, but it was calm and peaceful. There were no bomb blasts that took place in Kabul at that time. In fact, the first gunfire that I heard was when Eid was being celebrated towards the time that the Bonn Accords were actually reached. So it was both a political as well as a religious celebration. The inauguration of Taliban, what I now call 3.0, because 2.0 was the phase of its radicalization in Pakistan. The inauguration of Taliban 3.0, in fact, started off with the August 27 bomb attack in the suicide bomb attack at the Kabul airport. And in so doing, it killed 200 Afghans, 13 US soldiers. And the question will always nag people. The airport, as well as Kabul, was being secured by the Haqqani network. The Haqqani network is being known to have, is being documented to have ties, of course, with the ISI, but also with the ISK. There are various elements at work there. The Lashkar-e-Taiba elements have been known to have ties with both ISI and ISK. So there are various threads that link both the Lashkar-e-Taiba as well as the Haqqani network and even elements of the ISK to the ISI. So the question will always nag. Was this something that escaped the Haqqani network that was conducted by the ISK? Or did the Haqqani network actually enable it in order to scare all those who were heading for the airport to leave Afghanistan for safer pastures? But what it does worry, what the concern that really matters for the future is that what kind of Afghanistan are we looking at in the near future? Are the Taliban going to be able to stabilize Afghanistan through their repressive route like they did in 1996-2001 with the help of both Pakistan and China? Or are we going to see a growing resistance? Because let's be clear about one thing. As I explained about the origin of the Taliban are not a homegrown force. There have been Islamist parties in Afghanistan through its history, particularly from the 60s and 70s, and even more so when the Soviets intervened. But the Taliban have had no Islamist presence in Afghanistan to date. They are an alien force. They are an alien ideology. What they believe in does not reflect the values and beliefs, even the religious beliefs of the Afghans, who have been largely much more moderate. And Charan Singh Saab, since you are there, you very well know of the Afghan Sikh community in Afghanistan, who have by and large lived peacefully and with respect in Afghanistan all through their history. So one possibility is after the initial shock wears off, that resistance will grow. We have seen flag protests, we have seen color protests, we have seen women's protests, we have seen violent resistance. But now we are also seeing attacks against the Taliban ostensibly attributed to the ISK. So we can perhaps in the near future project that the ISK contradiction with the Taliban and perhaps even with the Al-Qaeda, because there's a larger struggle for global supremacy in the jihad, may take shape in Afghanistan. Within the resistance also, we see, fault lines between the north and the south, between the Pashtuns and the North Pashtuns. And these are, very real fault lines that can take place. We are beginning to see, faction fighting within the Taliban, particularly between the Loya Kandahar, the Quetta Shura, and the Kandahar Shura, basically on the one hand, and the Haqqani network, or what is called the Loya Pattika, the eastern states of Afghanistan that border on Pakistan across the Durand line. So we are seeing multiple levels of tensions, frictions, conflicts. We are even seeing, frictions between elements and factions of the Afghan Taliban and the ISI. And of course, on top of all this, we have the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, which are a kindred group consisting of Pashtuns on the Pakistan side of the Durand line, who also want to impose a very similar kind of Sharia dispensation in Pakistan, which has already got a boost. Firstly, a lot of their prisoners have been released, and they have got a boost in Pakistan. So if I look at the future, of course, there's always the possibility of a good case scenario. There's a possibility of a straightforward, Taliban versus resistance kind of struggle. But if I really look honestly at the future looks extremely messy. And this is the kind of future that China too may be faced with. Now, China may think, just like the US thinks or thought that the Taliban could control the Al-Qaeda. The Russians think that perhaps the Taliban can control the ISK from destabilizing the Central Asian republics. The Chinese may think that the Taliban can control the ETIM and the other Uyghur elements from destabilizing Xinjiang. But the reality is that it will be impossible for China to do what it wants to do by simply tackling only the ETIM. And China will have to take a call on whether it wants to get involved in stabilizing Afghanistan, or whether the Taliban will want to or be capable of stabilizing Taliban when the Soviet Union and the Americans in the past have failed. And in fact, I will actually say that we need to think behind into the Pakistani mind. If Pakistan has achieved its first goal of occupying and invading and now dominating Afghanistan, we also need to think, what are the next steps? For example, what with all these 20 to 30 other radical groups, what will they do? Actually, now in many ways, it is their turn to be able to get what they wanted. Effectively, Afghanistan has been made a safe haven for many of these extremist groups to pursue their own agendas. Taliban does not necessarily have to be directly involved. They may be satisfied with Afghanistan, but these groups will want to conduct their or prosecute their activities, in whether it's in Tajikistan or Uzbekistan or Iran or India or even in Pakistan itself. So, this is what we are looking at. And we're also looking at, if Pakistan has done this in Afghanistan, and if it's done this for strategic depth, which it has always wanted, what would be its next plan towards India? And maybe already what we are seeing in the kind of attacks that have started against minorities in Kashmir is just the first part of their plan that is beginning to be unveiled. And we need to think ahead, get into the Pakistani ISI mind, and imagine what could be their agenda in India and perhaps in Central Asia, and how that conflicts in many ways or coincides with the Chinese agenda. So overall, I'll just wrap up in the next 2 minutes very quickly. Overall, if I had to summarize the strategic fallout, it would be three. One is that after 20 years of the ouster of the Taliban, terrorism in Afghanistan and Central Asia and the AFPAC region is back with a bang, and that it is very likely to radiate outward from Afghanistan towards the immediate region around it. And it does not include the rest of the world, because the Al-Qaeda and IS rivalry will also be played out there. The second is that clearly it's advantaged China. US withdrawal, US might think that it may be able to contain China operating from the Indo-Pacific, but they are giving China an opportunity towards Central Asia and towards the Gulf, which means that China has an opportunity to extend its wings to that region. It's by no means a foregone conclusion that China will succeed. My guess is that they will burn their fingers and they'll recoil, but they will go back to kind of positioning mode to take advantage in future. And it will certainly also look at its economic resources. And the third thing, which ties up with this, is what does it mean in terms of values that the modern world has grown up with since the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the American Wars of Independence, the two World Wars, and the Indian struggle of independence, which were basically about freedom, individual liberties, democracy, human rights, and so on. So China gets an opportunity to provide the wide authoritarian umbrella within which single party rule, communist rule, theocratic, even violent theocratic rule, even majoritarian democracies might be able to find a kind of shelter. And when we see a development like AUKUS, we are tempted to think that in many ways the United States is now taking refuge within a conservative Anglosphere, even to the extent of sacrificing the liberal Anglosphere that includes New Zealand and Canada, by adding an even more elite component in its kind of strategic investments towards security in the world. But the general message is that democracy has been betrayed in Afghanistan. It is being betrayed in Myanmar. If there are people who are looking for freedom, even for freedom within Islam, moderate Islam, as opposed to an extremist Islam, who will the world turn to? In fact, there are no particular saviors in the world or there are no particular defenders left for freedom and democracy and human rights at this point of time. So I think I'll end at that, because I think it's now 4:40. I'd like to leave at least 20 minutes for the question and answer. I hope I haven't been too fast.
That's okay. While the chairman is back, I just had a few questions, Mr. Ambassador.
Sure.
Your talk has been so beautiful. I've been watching this because it impacts India's economy. So I've been very eagerly listening and reading about it. But you really summarized everything so well that things are quite clear to us. But here are some few points before we open up the forum for questions from others.
Right.
One is you probably hinted, and I think that USA has had a fallout, and as you concluded, whom do we turn to now? So how do you think USA will recover from that post or that unipolar world that it had created as a guardian of social or political conscience across the globe? Second, you are right. Within Afghanistan, there are Pashtuns and non-Pashtuns. Do you think Afghanistan will break up in days to come? Because non-Pashtuns are also very upset with the way the Pashtuns corner all the important locations and positions. The third, I was always thinking, maybe as a silver line, that now Pakistan, which to me has always been a center of gravity of terrorism, and because it is so much full of terrorism, it exported terrorism to anybody and everybody who wanted it. Anybody who wanted to outsource terrorism, Pakistan had somebody to offer to them, an agency or something. And I thought now, with what they have created in Afghanistan, they will be engaged in Afghanistan because of the political turmoil in Afghanistan, and India will be spared of some stupid adventures. Of course, last few days don't bear me out. And as you rightly said, they are chasing the minorities in Kashmir and demonstrating that probably they'll come back to us with a vengeance. But my thought was that they have enough on their platter to stay engaged elsewhere and spare India. And my last question is, Ambassador, you've been in this foreign service almost half a century. You have been into this policy making and looking at geopolitics. Where do you see the geopolitics in the region 15 years from today, or when we celebrate our 100 years of independence, when Pakistan also spends its 100 years of independence? Where do you see these two countries and the geopolitics? I just want to conclude by saying, will China play the role of the cat and the monkeys? And,
Right.
and will it become worse from where we are now? Thank you.
Thank you. So let me start by these four questions that are very perceptive. And so, I think what was the first question? Who do we turn to now? Will Afghanistan break up? So I think, in terms of turning to now, I think the message is very clear, and it has always been clear. And I think if it has not been clear to us, then we have made a mistake. Is that ultimately your security and your destiny is in your own hands. And in many ways, we have to, particularly in the context of the economy, we have to be very clear in our mind what constitutes national strength. Does national strength come from a strong national economy, or does it come from just a strong military power or a strong ideology and so on? This was a question that I have actually debated with some senior leaders in the past as well. And I would say that, one of the ways that we were looking at Afghanistan, at least in my time, when we thought of investing in the Hajika iron ore mines, was very much in terms of our kind of economic growth and economic integration also with Afghanistan. Unfortunately, the United States, for one, despite knowing that Afghanistan sat on 3 trillion worth of minerals, did not make any move either to invest it or to encourage others to invest in it, or in fact do anything to help Afghanistan stand on its own feet. So this was one problem. And I think this is a very bitter lesson that the Afghans themselves have learned. That, for their 20-year dependence on the United States, at the end of it, which they did partly for the United States interests in terrorism, they have really got nothing. They have just, they feel extremely betrayed. Secondly, on the breakup, I painted a very negative worst case scenario for Afghanistan. It really depends on how long it goes, how strong the resistance is. As you know, now the son of Ahmed Shah Massoud, Ahmed Massoud, has launched a national resistance front. I think in the next couple of years, we will see what kind of support it gets inside the country, what kind of support it can mobilize outside the country, whether it can be a viable alternative to the Taliban, what kind of position the international community, particularly China, takes towards it. It's hugely complicated. But I would say that if China and Pakistan are not able to stabilize Afghanistan into an inclusive and united country, then the chances of breakup. This is not something that I talk very loosely, because if you look at South Asia, Afghanistan is the one country that does not at this moment have a separatist movement. But the opposition to extremism, the opposition to Taliban, theocracy and Taliban extremism could lead to a kind of separation along North-South lines, along Pashtun, non-Pashtun lines, where a lot of people see that the Taliban phenomenon is identified with the Pashtuns and Pakistan. So I don't rule that out, but I would say it's a distant possibility and there's a lot of steps on the way. Third, Pakistan. Again, this is a question of analyzing the Pakistani mind. One problem is that when you, as you know very well, as it happened in Punjab, once you ride a tiger, it's extremely difficult to dismount. And even if you bring China as a new kind of rider, this will remain a very major challenge. I think we should be at least we should be prepared. Our preparation should be along the lines that Pakistan hasn't concluded its kind of revanchist agenda against India. Everything that it has been doing in Afghanistan it has been doing basically to deprive India of space, to take total political tutelage of Afghanistan, and be able to use Afghanistan against us, whether it is in terms of a conventional, conventional conflict, or in terms of unconventional warfare through terrorism. So I would say it's a matter of prudence that we should think that Pakistan will continue with this agenda, and having achieved its first step, which is strategic depth in Afghanistan, start anticipating what it will do next. And since Pakistan's animosity against India has never ended and has not ended even now, we should expect them to try to take advantage of fault lines within our own society, of problems within J&K, and anything that it can get in its armory to be able to continue its proxy war, its destabilization agenda inside India. So we should be extremely prepared. And remember, a lot of extremist outfits will have been emboldened by the Taliban success in Afghanistan. So they're also on a kind of, in a kind of uplifted frame of mind. And finally, what will things look like 20 years from now, let's say 25 years from now? So, here is what I think. I think it is actually impossible for any authoritarian setup to suppress freedoms, what we basically know as freedoms, permanently for a long time or permanently. Resistance, the spirit of freedom, the desire for freedom will remain and will continue, whether it is in Afghanistan or in other places. And eventually, people are taking a lot of inspiration from China, that here is a country that has managed to stay in power as an authoritarian, communist, dictatorial, even a totalitarian power for 70 years. And China provides a model of being in power almost in perpetuity. That's the great temptation of China, not anything else. It's just very tempting for people in power to copy the Chinese model because it gives you a long hold on power. But I have sincere doubts that even with the help of artificial intelligence and all the kind of surveillance and digital surveillance that is available, that the human spirit will remain crushed forever. The last time the Taliban lasted 5 years, and in return we got 20 years of relative stability, peace, and prosperity. I would imagine that something similar is likely to happen. So in our 100th anniversary, I look forward to some optimism.
Yeah, Ambassador, may I ask the question?
Sure.
I'm Ashok Vishandas,
Yes.
EGROW Director.
Yes.
See, it was a masterful exposition, Ambassador Gautam. I have two questions.
Please.
I mean, hypothetically, suppose you put the clock 20 years back, and you yourself said that there were number of strategic mistakes the
Right.
USA had done.
Right.
What they could have done differently so that it could not have landed itself in a messy situation and very great embarrassment. That is question one.
Excellent.
And second, having known the character, let me quote Vijay Gokhale in his recent book. He said China is a great deception. All said and done this. Now, inter-country relationship between Pakistan and China, do you think they will be always on the same side of the line, or there will be conflict between them also, because China is not dependable and trustworthy.
Right.
So yeah. So yes.
Yeah. So the mistakes. Of course, hindsight is a great teacher. But I would say that if the lessons I had to learn from this, one is that this whole idea of my country first, I think has its limits. The United States entered Afghanistan with very narrow objectives. Its only interest was counterterrorism, and that too focused against Al Qaeda, because Al Qaeda had bombed it in East Africa and then had bombed it in its own lands, right? Yes. At the time that the United States intervened, it had the support and cooperation of the whole world and the Afghan people. Even Russia, that today is against it, even China, that was today is against it, supported the US mission in Afghanistan to eliminate global terrorism. Now, at that stage, I think the United States could have thought of a broader agenda, not just its narrow self-interest in Al Qaeda, and could have thought of a cooperative counterterrorism and counterterrorism strategy that covered the interests of the entire region. Both, it could have included India, it could have included China, it could have included Russia. Perhaps Iran is a different kettle of fish, but it could have formed a much broader coalition to actively enlarge the scope of its interests. Number one. Number two, it could have actually invested in all the things that it claimed to have invested, which is an Afghan national army. What they did was, because they defined their intervention in counterterrorism terms, they only developed the counterterrorism capacities of the Afghan National Army. And so the Afghan National Army was very capable of retaking targets under terrorist attack, or even sometimes towns that had been taken over by the Taliban with the help of US air support, like they did in Kunduz and Ghazni. But they simply did not develop the Afghan National Army as a standing army, like the Indian Army or like the Pakistani Army it is. And it cost them per soldier 15 times more to do this. Effectively, people talk about an Afghan National Army of about 350,000. Effective fighting force was not more than 50,000, which was the strength of the Taliban. Okay, so, but they didn't even invest in the economy. They didn't invest in trade integration, creating markets for Afghan produce. They didn't invest in the mineral economy. They didn't invest in the livelihood economy. They turned their attention to Iraq and actually conveyed very poor signals to Pakistan. They did not even, frankly, invest in democracy. All that they were interested in doing was boardroom politics, manipulating elections as well as deciding who's going to run the country. So, frankly, the United States did not invest anything in Afghanistan because it never considered Afghanistan to be of strategic importance to them. So I would just leave it at that, because this is a much longer subject and I could go on much further, but at least you get a taste of what I think were the failures. And the second question that you asked was, could you just quickly refresh me?
Yeah, that was the inter-country relation between China and Pakistan. Once the Pakistan...
Yeah, very, very interesting question, because, fundamentally there is a strategic divergence in objectives between China and Pakistan. Pakistan wants stability. China wants stability for its strategic outreach. Pakistan wants instability because it fears that the moment any Afghan returns to Afghanistan and gets out of its control, it will turn against it, like it happened with the Mujahideen. It suspects the Taliban also to do the same. So it always has a number of horses in the field, so that the moment one or the other gets defiant or disobedient, they will be suppressed and replaced by another. So this is a recipe for keeping the house burning, lest they turn against you. But Pakistan has a dual strategy. I think its first option would be if it can get China to help it to both control Afghanistan as well as to stabilize Afghanistan. Of course, that's the perfect, perfect recipe. The question is, when it does not happen, we can expect to see frictions and divisions between China and Pakistan. It will be actually cold comfort to us because, China and India have opposing interests. China wants Afghanistan oriented towards Central Asia, and we want Afghanistan to remain part of, its kind of historic relationship with India. So I'm not so sure that divergence will necessarily lead to cooperation between India and China.
Great. Thank you very much.
I think there were some other questions. I still have 2 minutes. So what significant efforts can the Indian government take? May I just take that question, because I think it's a very important question.
I would also like you to consider the question by Laskar, the question above that.
Okay, I can't see it. So can you just read it out to me?
Yeah, he says, why couldn't the Afghan forces better resist the Taliban despite all the US training and assistance?
No, as I told you, I think that US training was overstated because US training was extremely limited. And the fact is that you cannot suddenly convert from a kind of insurgent army or from a kind of third world army to a high-tech army that the NATO was. You see, NATO involvement came with NATO standards, NATO equipment, NATO doctrines, NATO interoperability, none of which, you don't have a defense industrial kind of infrastructure to support it. First build up your capacities in simple things like repair and maintenance and, military logistics, military engineering, infantry divisions that can defend your territory and, things like that before you build upwards. So, I think this kind of deep dependence in unsuitable technologies had a big role, but I think also the psychological effect of a complete withdrawal. Let me turn back to the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Even though the disintegration of the Soviet Union was a much more slower motion process, our establishment was left hanging for a long time, trying to cope with the changes, both in the defense sphere as well as in the political sphere. It took us a long time to be able to get out of that kind of shock. So, shocks like this have a kind of deep psychological effect. And I think we need to give the Afghans a little time to recover from this kind of dependence and this kind of feeling of betrayal that they have. And I think I'm just very tempted to say this last question. I think people tend to assume that just because the Taliban have come to power and we did not invest the Taliban, we have lost everything. That's really not true. I mean, the first things that we can do is to continue to provide scholarships, continue to provide medical treatment, continue to keep our country open to travelers and visa seekers from Afghanistan, maybe even provide hospitality and a place for their media activities, for their civil society activists, even for their political activists. Why not? Because in the end, the Taliban can never be a strategic substitute for the progressive generation, progressive, moderate Islamic Republic that we helped nurture for the last 20 years. And that is not dead and gone. That is still the majority of Afghanistan. There's a lot that we can do. We can even continue trade. Most of the trade that operates from Afghanistan to India comes from the Pashtun area. They're mostly done by private business. Why should we close that market? If the Pakistani-Chinese ambition is to actually sever relations, we should go the other way to ensure that those relations continue. I wonder if I've lost sound. I think I have to end now, Mr. Charan Singh. So maybe
I would now urge the chairman to give his observations, and then we will close.
Very quickly, first of all, thank you, Ambassador Mukhopadhaya, for a brilliant exposition of a set of very, very complicated issues. You address so many issues and you address them so well. Why Afghan collapsed so easily? What was U.S. mission's objectives and how far? I mean, what was the park design involved? Should we accept Taliban as it is? And the humanitarian issues which are involved. A very broad range of issues you handle, and the interrelationship between China, role of China, Pakistan, as it affects not only the Middle Asia, but also as it affects India. The questions also, I must congratulate all those people who asked very, very good questions. There were 3 or 4 breaks which were unfortunately very unfortunate, because
so sorry.
We lost track of at least 4 times.
Oh.
And we really feel we missed out on something very important that you were saying. But that apart, to the extent that it was audible, I have to say that this was a wonderful session. You handled, Your Excellency, you handled questions very, very well. And the discussion was also very good. The light to heat ratio was excellent. So there was more light and less heat, although the subject has been so contentious. So thank you very much. And I once again congratulate EGROW and Dr. Charan Singh and his team for having organized such a wonderful talk by such a great speaker like Ambassador Mukhopadhaya. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jadhav. I'm honored by your observations. And thank you, Mr. Charan Singh, for providing me this platform and opportunity. Many thanks to all the audience and all their questions.
The recording will be available tomorrow by noon on our website. I'll send a copy personally to both the chairman as the speaker.
Please.
The next week, 15th is Dasra. We don't have any event. But on 22nd, we have Sachin Chaturvedi speaking to us on India-China trade. I would welcome all of you, same time, 4 to 5, to come and please participate in the discussion by Sachin Chaturvedi. He is also Minister of State rank in Madhya Pradesh. He is heading their planning commission, as well as he's the CEO of RIS Delhi. With that, I must thank both once again the chairman to have spared time to speak to us and chair the session today, to the ambassador to speak to us and share his thoughts, and the participants who have shared their questions with all of us to enrich this discussion. Thank you, take care, and see you all in 2 weeks from now.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Sir.
Thank you, everyone.